The fluorescent lights of the Willow Hollow Estates community clubhouse cast a sterile, unforgiving glow on the proceedings. Rodney Fielding sat at a folding table facing the board of directors, a 5-person tribunal arranged behind a long dais, like a panel of weary, suburban gods. He felt a familiar knot tighten in his stomach. The same slow-burning anxiety he used to get before a 5-alarm fire. But this was different. There was no smoke, no adrenaline, just the quiet, suffocating pressure of procedural warfare. This was his appeal. At the center of the dais sat Betty Dobbins, board president. Her posture was impeccable, a testament to decades of self-imposed rigidity. Her silver hair was sculpted into a helmet of unflappable authority, and her floral blazer, worn despite the stuffy air in the room, seemed to serve as a kind of ceremonial armor. She did not look at him. Instead, she stared at a document on the table before her, her lips a thin, unmoving line. "Mr. Fielding," she began, her voice as crisp and bloodless as a new $100 bill. "We are here to review your appeal regarding violation notice number WH 2024-0515, issued for a breach of covenants, conditions, and restrictions, Section 8.4.2, pertaining to nuisances." Rodney cleared his throat, his own voice sounding rough and out of place in the pristine silence. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you for seeing me." He slid a single sheet of paper across the table. "This is regarding the alleged smoke nuisance from my barbecue. I have a signed letter here from my direct next-door neighbor, Mr. Henderson, whose property abuts mine. He states that he has never been bothered by the smoke and, in fact, enjoys the smell." Betty's eyes flickered toward the paper, but she made no move to take it. To her right, a man in a polo shirt from the HOA's management company, present via a speakerphone on the table, crackled to life. "For the record, this is Paul from Crestwood Management. The board's decision is not contingent on the opinion of a single neighbor, but on the community standard as a whole." Betty nodded, a barely perceptible dip of her chin. The complaint was filed. Mr. Fielding. It was investigated by a board-appointed observer. She glanced at a mousy woman at the end of the table, who flinched under the attention. The observation confirmed that smoke was visibly crossing property lines. "It was a windy day," Rodney countered, keeping his tone level. He had practiced this, coached by his wife, Sarah. No anger, just facts. "Wind is a natural phenomenon. My smoker is located over 50 feet from any property line. I use seasoned oak, which produces a clean, light smoke." He was a retired firefighter. He knew smoke. He knew its properties, its dangers, and its behavior. He knew the difference between a nuisance and an actual hazard. This was not a hazard. Betty finally lifted her gaze from her script. Her eyes were pale blue and held the flat, unwavering certainty of a zealot. "The governing documents are clear. Mr. Fielding, no noxious or offensive activity shall be carried on upon any lot, nor shall anything be done thereon which may be or may become an annoyance or nuisance to the neighborhood. The board has interpreted your continuous, large-scale smoke production as falling under this clause." "With all due respect," Rodney said, the polite words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Who defines noxious or annoyance? It feels very subjective." Betty picked up her gavel, a small polished wood thing that looked like a toy, but carried the weight of absolute power in this room. "The board defines it. That is our function." She looked down the table at the other 3 members. One was studying his cuticles. Maria, a younger woman who lived 3 doors down, gave Rodney a brief, apologetic glance before looking away. Margaret, a stern-looking woman in her 60s, simply nodded in time with Betty's words. "The hearing is concluded. Betty announced, her voice devoid of any emotion. "The board has reviewed the evidence provided by management. The appeal is denied. The $100 fine stands, due within 30 days. A record of this decision will be entered into the minutes." She brought the gavel down with a sharp, final crack. Rodney sat there for a moment, the sound echoing in the quiet room. He had presented evidence. He had made a logical case. He had been polite, and none of it had mattered. He was publicly, and with meticulous procedural correctness, dismissed. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping against the linoleum. He picked up his neighbor's letter, now a useless piece of paper. As he walked out of the clubhouse, the heavy glass door clicking shut behind him, he knew this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The smell of home, for Rodney Fielding, was a delicate balance of Sarah's lavender-scented candles and the faint, lingering ghost of hickory smoke that clung to the screened-in porch. For 30 years, his life had been dictated by the shriek of an alarm and the acrid stench of chemical fires. Now, in retirement, his world was built on peace, predictability, and the low and slow alchemy of turning tough cuts of meat into something tender and sublime. His smoker, a custom-built offset rig he called the Arbiter, was his pride and joy. It sat on a poured concrete slab in the far corner of his 2.3-acre property, a gentle giant of welded steel. Barbecuing wasn't just a hobby, it was his therapy. It was how he connected with the world on his own terms. It was the anchor of his quiet life with Sarah. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of chamomile tea. When he came home, he could see the tension in her shoulders before she even spoke. How did it go? He sank into the chair opposite her, the weight of the meeting settling upon him. They denied the appeal. The fine stands. She reached across the table and took his hand. Her skin was cool. "I'm sorry, honey." Sarah suffered from chronic migraines, a condition that flared violently with stress. He saw the faint lines of pain around her eyes and felt a surge of protective anger. Not at her, but at the situation. This was precisely the kind of pointless, bureaucratic friction he had structured their retirement to avoid. "It's not the money, Sarah. It's the principle." She wouldn't even look at Henderson's letter. "It's like the decision was made before I even walked in the door." He shook his head. "It's Betty. She's got some kind of problem with me." Betty Dobbins was a neighborhood legend, and not in a good way. She had been board president for 5 of the last 6 years, running Willow Hollow Estates with the obsessive precision of a military dictator. Rodney had heard stories. He'd seen her from a distance on her morning patrols, walking the common areas with a clipboard, sometimes accompanied by a tape measure to check lawn heights against the architectural guidelines. She had an encyclopedic knowledge of the CC&Rs, a document thick enough to stop a door, and she wielded its vaguely worded clauses like weapons. "What are you going to do?" Sarah asked quietly, her thumb tracing patterns on the back of his hand. "Pay the $100. I guess. What else can I do? But I'm going to look at our closing documents again. I've always been sure we're not technically part of the HOA." He got up and went to the small office where they kept their important papers. He pulled out a thick file folder labeled House and spread the contents on the desk. There it was, the deed, the title insurance, and the plat map from the original survey when they bought the property 5 years ago. He ran his finger along the thick, black line defining his land. A dotted line, clearly labeled Willow Hollow Estates Phase 2 boundary, ran parallel to his property, but was situated about 10 feet beyond his fence. He was outside of it. He'd always known it. He had specifically chosen this lot for that very reason. "See," he said, bringing the map to Sarah. "We're not in. She has no jurisdiction." Sarah studied the map. Then why are they sending you notices? I don't know, he admitted. Maybe the boundaries were redrawn, but we would have had to be notified. We would have had to sign something. He flipped through the stack of papers again. Nothing. No annexation agreement. No updated deed. He decided to check the HOA's governing documents himself. A quick search brought him to the Willow Hollow Estates community website, where the CC&Rs were posted as a public PDF. He downloaded the file and searched for the nuisance clause Betty had cited, Rugger 8.4.2. He read the words again. Annoyance, or nuisance to the neighborhood. It was a masterclass in subjective language. A legal gray area so vast you could lose a whole neighborhood in it. It was a clause built for abuse. That night, unable to sleep, he called his best friend, Jake, a fellow retired firefighter who had moved to a cabin in the mountains to escape the very idea of an HOA. She's got you on atmospheric consistency codes. Jake's laughter boomed through the phone. Rodney, that's not a thing. She made that up. No. The official one is nuisance, Rodney corrected him, pacing the living room floor. But it feels just as made up. The point is, I don't think I'm even in her kingdom. The plat map shows me outside the boundary. Then that's it. Man, Jake said, send her a copy of the map and tell her to pound sand. Respectfully. I'm going to have to, Rodney said, his voice hardening with resolve. I'm not going to let this woman and her binder of rules dictate whether I can enjoy my own backyard. This is our peace. You know I'm not letting her take it. 2 weeks later, the $100 fine paid under protest. Rodney thought the worst might be over. He had spent the weekend smoking a brisket, a deliberately smaller, less smoky affair, just to be a good neighbor. He had been careful, mindful, and compliant. He thought, perhaps, that would be the end of it. He was wrong. On a Tuesday afternoon, the mail carrier's truck lingered at his mailbox longer than usual. A moment later, the carrier was walking up his driveway, holding a clipboard and a pale green envelope. Certified mail. Rodney's heart sank. Nothing good ever arrived via certified mail. He signed the form and took the envelope inside, a sense of dread chilling his skin. He slid it open with a kitchen knife. The letterhead was from Crestwood Management. Formal violation notice was printed in bold, uncompromising letters at the top. Dear Mr. Fielding, this letter serves as a formal notice of a continuing violation of the Willow Hollow Estates governing documents. A recent inspection of your property on date by a member of the Architectural Control Committee ACC has identified a violation of Architectural Guideline, Farger 4.1, all permanent or semi-permanent structures, including sheds, gazebos, and cooking installations, must be pre-approved by the Architectural Control Committee ACC. The large smoking apparatus, located in your rear yard, has been classified as a semi-permanent structure, and no prior application for its installation is on file. This constitutes a significant breach of community standards. A fine of $500 has been assessed to your account. You have 14 days from the date of this notice to either submit a retroactive architectural application for the structure approval not guaranteed, or remove it from the property entirely. Failure to cure this violation within the prescribed timeframe will result in further sanctions, including additional fines and the potential for legal action at your expense. Rodney read the letter 3 times. His hands were shaking. This was no longer about smoke. This was about his smoker, the arbiter. He had built part of it himself. It was an attack on his passion, his sanctuary, and the fine $500 was wildly punitive. It was a declaration of war. He looked out the window at his smoker, standing sentinel in the yard, an unapproved structure. It had been there for 5 years. visible to anyone who cared to look. And only now, after he had challenged a nuisance fine. Was it suddenly a problem? This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a targeted campaign. Sarah came into the room, saw the letter in his hand and the look on his face. "What is it?" He handed it to her. He watched as she read it, her face paling, her hand rising to her temple as if to ward off an impending headache. $500 for your smoker. "She's escalating," Rodney said, his voice a low growl. "This is harassment, Sarah, pure and simple." The personal stake was no longer just about peace and quiet. It was about protecting Sarah from this stress, from the migraines that would surely follow. He saw the flicker of pain in her eyes, and his resolve hardened into something cold and sharp. He wasn't just fighting for his hobby anymore. He was fighting for his family. He was fighting for his home. Rodney spent the next 2 days methodically preparing his response. He was a firefighter. He knew how to handle an emergency. You didn't rush in. You assessed the situation. You gathered your tools. And you executed a plan. Anger was fuel. But it had to be controlled, or it would burn you up. His plan was to engage through official channels, creating a clear, undeniable paper trail. He scanned his original property deed and the official plat map from their closing, saving them as high-resolution PDF files. He then composed a formal, meticulously polite letter addressed to Paul at Crestwood Management, with a carbon copy to the HOA Board of Directors. He laid out his case with the dispassionate clarity of an incident report. He stated that his property, located at 1120 Oak Ridge Lane, was not, and had never been, legally incorporated into the Willow Hollow Estates HOA. He attached the plat map as Exhibit A, highlighting the clear boundary line. He attached his deed as Exhibit B, noting the absence of any riders or covenants, linking his property to the association. He concluded the letter by respectfully asserting that since his property was outside the HOA's jurisdiction, its governing documents, including Architectural Guideline, FARA 4.1, were not applicable to him. Therefore, all fines were invalid, and he demanded they be rescinded immediately and that his address be removed from their records. He requested a formal written response confirming their compliance within 10 business days. He sent the email and felt a small measure of satisfaction. It was irrefutable. It was documented. It was professional. They would see their error, apologize, and this whole ridiculous affair would be over. 8 days later, a reply landed in his inbox. It was not from Paul at Crestwood Management. It was from a senior partner at a law firm he'd never heard of Barrows. Finch & Associates, counsel for Willow Hollow Estates. The letter was a masterpiece of corporate legal stonewalling. Dear Mr. Fielding, this firm represents the Willow Hollow Estates Homeowners Association. We are in receipt of your correspondence dated June 5th. After a thorough review of the association's official records, we can confirm that the property located at 1120 Oak Ridge Lane is indeed subject to the recorded covenants, conditions, and restrictions of Willow Hollow Estates. The association's governing documents are legally binding upon your property. While we appreciate you providing your own documents, the association's records are deemed to be correct and controlling in this matter. All violation notices and associated fines are valid and remain in full effect. Payment for the outstanding balance of $600 is due immediately. Please be advised that this firm has been retained to handle all further communication on this matter. Any attempt to engage directly with the board of directors or management company can be misconstrued. All future correspondence must be submitted in writing to our offices for proper documentation and review. Governed accordingly. Jonathan Barrows, Esc. Rodney stared at the screen, a cold fury rising in his chest. They hadn't addressed his evidence. They had simply ignored it. The association's records are deemed to be correct and controlling. It was the most circular, nonsensical piece of legal jargon he had ever encountered. They were declaring themselves right simply because their own records, which he was claiming were wrong, said they were right. He had presented them with facts, and they had responded with a form letter from a high-priced lawyer. He had followed the rules, used the official channels, and had been met with a bureaucratic brick wall so solid and seamless it felt like something out of a nightmare. He was trapped in their system, a system that had no apparent mechanism for correcting its own errors. The message was clear. They had more power, more money, and a bigger lawyer. And they intended to use all of it. The lawyer's letter was a turning point. Rodney realized that polite emails and old plat maps were not going to cut it. He was no longer dealing with a misunderstanding. He was fighting an institution that had already decided he was guilty. He needed more than just evidence. He needed ammunition. His first call was to Jake. He read the lawyer's letter aloud, his voice tight with frustration. "Wow," Jake said after a long pause. "They're not even pretending to be reasonable. Don't let her take this away from you. Man, this is your piece." Jake's words, simple and direct, cut through the noise. This was his piece. It was worth fighting for. "I'm not going to," Rodney said, his resolve hardening. "I'm going to prove it so definitively they won't have a leg to stand on." He knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed an expert, someone who understood the labyrinthine world of property records and legal filings. After a few hours of research, he found him a Mr. Arthur Harrison, a semi-retired title clerk who now ran a small, independent land record research service out of a dusty office downtown. His website promised forensic-level document retrieval and analysis. It sounded like exactly what Rodney needed. Mr. Harrison was a small, meticulous man with wire-rimmed glasses and a quiet, dry wit. He listened to Rodney's story without interruption, his fingers steepled under his chin. He examined Rodney's plat map and the lawyer's letter with the focused intensity of a watchmaker. "It's a classic case of institutional inertia," Mr. Harrison said, his voice a gravelly whisper. "The management company and the lawyers are working from a database. To them, the database is reality. Your evidence is an anomaly that threatens their reality, so they dismiss it." He peered at Rodney over his glasses. "Our job, Mr. Fielding, is to present them with a new reality so well documented it cannot be ignored." Rodney hired him on the spot. For the next week, Mr. Harrison became his investigator, his guide into the public record. Rodney provided him with every document he had. Mr. Harrison, in turn, began to pull the official history of Willow Hollow Estates from the county's digital and physical archives. He started with a new, certified survey of Rodney's property. The surveyor's report came back a few days later, confirming what Rodney already knew. His property line was definitively 10 feet outside the official boundary of the HOA. That was the first piece of new ammunition. Then, Mr. Harrison dug deeper. He pulled the HOA's original Articles of Incorporation from 1998. He pulled every revision, every annex plat for Phase 2 and Phase 3. And then he found something else. "Mr. Fielding," Mr. Harrison said over the phone a week after they first met, "I found something odd. I was reviewing the publicly available board meeting minutes for the association, going back 10 years. Mostly procedural stuff, approving budgets, reviewing bids for lawn care, but the minutes from June of 2018 are incomplete." "What do you mean, incomplete?" Rodney asked. "I mean, they're heavily redacted," Mr. Harrison explained. "There's a whole section blacked out under new business. That's unusual for public HOA records, unless it pertains to pending litigation or sensitive homeowner-specific violations. But this is different. It looks like a deliberate obfuscation. "What's the significance of June 2018?" Rodney asked. There was a rustle of papers on the other end of the line. According to the minutes from the month before, May 2018, that was the month Betty Dobbins was elected board president for the first time. A chill went down Rodney's spine. A mystery was beginning to form, one that went deeper than a simple boundary dispute. The redacted minutes felt like a locked door, and he was becoming more and more certain that Betty Dobbins was standing on the other side, holding the key. The following Monday, Rodney met Mr. Harrison at his office. The small room was filled with the smell of old paper and stale coffee. Harrison had a stack of documents spread across his desk, like a game of solitaire. Each one a piece of a puzzle Rodney was desperate to solve. "First, the good news," Mr. Harrison said, sliding a large, freshly printed survey map across the desk. "This is the certified survey. It's legally admissible and stamped by a licensed state surveyor. It confirms, without a shadow of a doubt, that your entire 2.3-acre lot, including the location of your barbecue smoker, is outside the legal boundary of Willow Hollow Estates, as recorded in the county plat records." Rodney felt a wave of relief. This was the silver bullet. This is it. Then, "I send this to the lawyer, and they have to back down." Mr. Harrison held up a hand, his expression cautious. "Ordinarily, yes, but I'm afraid it's not that simple." He slid another document forward. It was a single page, dense with legal text and stamped with the seal of the county clerk. At the top, it read, "Corrective Affidavit." "I found this filed in the county land records," Mr. Harrison said grimly. "It was filed in late June of 2018, just after those redacted meeting minutes." Rodney's eyes scanned the document. He didn't understand most of the legalese, but he saw his own street name and a vague description of a small, unplatted parcel adjacent to the northern border of the Willow Hollow Estates development. "What is this?" Rodney asked, his earlier relief evaporating. "It's a legal instrument, albeit a flimsy one, that an entity can use to correct a perceived error in a public record, like a typo in a legal description," Harrison explained. "In this case, the HOA's lawyer filed this affidavit to unilaterally clarify the association's boundary. It vaguely asserts a claim over a sliver of land that just so happens to include the 10-foot buffer and the edge of your property." Rodney's mind reeled. Can they do that? Just claim my land without my knowledge or consent? "Legally, it's highly dubious," Mr. Harrison said. Tapping the paper, "A proper annexation requires a vote of the membership and the consent of the property owner being annexed. This affidavit is a legal shortcut, and a sloppy one at that. But here's the problem once filed. It becomes part of the official record. It creates what's called a cloud on the title. It's legally binding until it's challenged and overturned by a court order." The full weight of the situation crashed down on Rodney. This was the reason for the lawyer's confident, dismissive letter. They weren't relying on a simple database error. They were relying on a fraudulent legal document that Betty had apparently directed their lawyer to file 5 years ago. His property hadn't been part of the HOA, so she had changed the records to make it part of the HOA. "This is fraud," Rodney said, the word tasting bitter. "It certainly appears to be an act of bad faith." Mr. Harrison corrected him with professional precision. "Proving intent for criminal fraud would be difficult, but it's unquestionably an improper filing." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "This affidavit is the how. The question you need to answer, Mr. Fielding, is the why. And I suspect the answer to that is buried in whatever was blacked out in those June 2018 meeting minutes. Rodney left Mr. Harrison's office with a heavy feeling in his gut. He had the truth on his side. But the other side had a lie that was officially recorded with the county. He was no longer just fighting a fine. He was fighting to reclaim the legal integrity of his own property line. A line that had been secretly and illegally redrawn by a woman obsessed with control. Armed with the certified survey and the knowledge of the corrective affidavit, Rodney felt he had no choice but to escalate. He forwarded the new survey to Jonathan Barrows, the HOA's attorney, along with a formal demand that they immediately file a new affidavit to rescind the fraudulent one from 2018. He stated, in no uncertain terms, that their claim on his property was based on an improper legal filing and that all enforcement actions must cease immediately. The response was faster and more brutal than he could have imagined. Within 24 hours, an email from Barrows arrived. It was short, cold, and utterly devastating. Mr. Fielding, we are in receipt of your survey. It is irrelevant. The corrective affidavit filed in June 2018 and recorded with the county is a legally controlling document. The association stands by its validity until such time as you obtain a court order to the contrary. Your property is subject to the governing documents. Furthermore, your fines remain unpaid and are now past due. Please find attached a formal notice of intent to lien on your property. If your total outstanding balance of $1,500 is not paid in full within 30 days, the association will proceed with filing a lien against your property at 1120 Oak Ridge Lane to secure the debt. Rodney read the email, his blood running cold. A lien. They were threatening to put a legal claim on his house over barbecue smoke and a 5-year-old vendetta. The cost of fighting this in court, hiring a real estate attorney, paying filing fees. Discovery could easily run into tens of thousands of dollars. It was a sum they knew he would be hesitant to spend. They were using the cost of justice as a weapon against him. He felt helpless, backed into a corner by a corrupt system designed to protect itself. He was right. But being right didn't matter if you couldn't afford to prove it. That evening, as he was staring blankly at the legal threat on his computer screen, there was a soft knock on his front door. It was Maria, his neighbor from the HOA board. She looked nervous, glancing over her shoulder as if she were being watched. "Can I come in for a second?" she whispered. He ushered her inside. She stood awkwardly in the foyer, wringing her hands. "Rodney, I shouldn't be here," she started, her voice barely audible. "But I had to warn you. Betty she's on a crusade." "I gathered as much," Rodney said wryly. "No, you don't understand," Maria insisted. She held an emergency executive session. She told the board you hired an investigator and were planning to sue the HOA to dissolve its boundaries. She said you were trying to devalue all of our homes. She's whipping everyone into a frenzy, convincing them you're some kind of existential threat to the community. She used your survey as proof of your aggressive intentions. It was worse than he thought. Betty wasn't just attacking him. She was poisoning his reputation with his own neighbors, turning him into the villain. She controls the narrative. "Rodney," Maria said, her eyes pleading, "and she has the HOA's law firm on retainer. Fighting this could ruin you financially. Margaret is starting to have doubts. But the others, they're scared of Betty. They just go along." Rodney felt a profound sense of weariness. This was the moral obstacle, the one that went beyond money. He could fight and potentially win, but in the process, he would become a pariah, the man who sued his neighbors. "Thank you for telling me, Maria. I appreciate it." She nodded. still looking terrified. Before she left, she pressed a plain manila envelope into his hand. It was thin, containing only a few sheets of paper. "I can't be the one who gave you this," she whispered, her hand trembling. "But I was the board secretary back in 2018. I have the original, unredacted draft of the minutes. I think you should see it." She slipped out the door and disappeared into the twilight, leaving Rodney standing in his hallway, holding the one thing that could explain everything. He opened the envelope. There, on the second page, under the heading New Business, was the section that had been blacked out in the official record. It was a single, devastating paragraph, and it held the key. The clubhouse for the annual homeowners meeting was packed. Over 100 residents of Willow Hollow Estates sat in neat rows of folding chairs, fanning themselves with complimentary agenda printouts. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and suburban discontent. On the dais at the front of the room, Betty Dobbins presided, flanked by the rest of the board. She ran the meeting with her signature iron-fisted efficiency, moving through budget approvals and committee reports with relentless speed. Rodney sat in the third row, a simple leather portfolio on his lap. His heart hammered against his ribs. He had registered for one of the 3-minute public speaking slots available to homeowners at the end of the meeting. 3 minutes. 180 seconds to dismantle a 5-year deception. Next to the podium, a large digital clock had been set up, its red numbers stark against the beige wall. It currently read 3:00. "Finally," Betty said, her voice laced with weary impatience. "We move to the homeowner comment period. First on the list is Rodney Fielding." A murmur went through the crowd. All eyes turned to him as he walked to the podium. He placed his portfolio down and adjusted the microphone, his hands surprisingly steady. He looked directly at Betty, whose face was a mask of polite indifference. The clock was reset. It now read a bright, intimidating 5:00. An assistant pressed a button, and the countdown began. 4:59, 4:58. "Good evening," Rodney began, his voice calm and clear, amplified by the speakers. "My name is Rodney Fielding, and I live at 1120 Oak Ridge Lane. Many of you know me only as the subject of several recent violation notices. I'm here tonight to provide some context, because this issue is bigger than just me. It's about the integrity of this entire association." He opened his portfolio and took out his first piece of evidence. He used the provided document projector, and a clear, simple image flashed onto the large screen behind the board. 425, 424. "Exhibit A," he said, his voice gaining strength. "This is the official, original plat map for the Willow Hollow Estates development, as filed with the county. As you can all clearly see, the legal boundary of the HOA is here." He used a laser pointer to trace the dotted line. "And my property is here." He moved the red dot to his lot, showing the clear 10-foot gap. "According to the foundational documents of this community, I am not, and have never been, a member of this HOA." Whispers erupted in the audience. Betty's knuckles were white where she gripped her gavel. "Mr. Fielding, your time is for comments, not for presenting a legal case." Margaret, the stern-faced board member, leaned toward her microphone. "Let him speak." "Betty, he has the floor." The clock ticked on. 3:40, 3:39. "That raises a question," Rodney continued, his eyes scanning the faces in the crowd. "Why has this board, under the direction of President Dobbins, spent thousands of your dollars in association funds to pursue violations against a non-member? I believe the answer can be found in the association's own records." He swapped the document on the projector. The next image was a side-by-side comparison of two versions of the same page of meeting minutes. One was heavily redacted. The other was clean. 310, 309. Exhibit B, he announced, his voice ringing with authority. On the left is the public copy of the board minutes from June 2018. On the right, provided to me by a concerned resident, is the original, unredacted version. He pointed the laser at the crucial paragraph. I'd like to read this section aloud for the record. Following a discussion in executive session, a motion was made to consult legal counsel regarding a boundary clarification. The motion failed for lack of a second. President Dobbins then directed legal counsel independently to file a corrective affidavit to address a boundary ambiguity. This action follows an unresolved personal dispute between Ms. Dobbins and the prior owner of the adjacent property at 1120 Oak Ridge Lane regarding a shared fence line and a felled tree. The room fell into a shocked silence, broken only by a few audible gasps. The board never held a valid vote, Rodney stated, letting the words hang in the air. This entire campaign against me was not initiated to protect community standards or property values. It was started by Betty Dobbins 5 years ago as a personal vendetta against the man who used to own my house. She abused her power as president, bypassed a failed board vote, and directed the HOA's lawyer to file a fraudulent document to seize jurisdiction over my property, all without my knowledge or consent. He put his final document on the projector, 201, 20. Exhibit C, he said. This is a brand new, legally certified survey of my property, confirming once again that my home, my yard, and, yes, my barbecue smoker, are not on HOA land. The clock showed 1:45. He had them. He could have ended it there. He could have called for Betty's immediate removal. But as he looked out at the stunned faces of his neighbors, he remembered his motivation. It wasn't revenge. It was peace. He decided to take a different path. But I'm not here tonight just to prove a point, he said, his tone shifting from prosecutorial to constructive. He turned off the laser pointer. I'm here to be a good neighbor. The initial fine I received was for a smoke nuisance, citing CC&R Section 8.4.2. He looked directly at the crowd. Now, I disagree with the way that rule was applied to me, but I don't disagree with the spirit behind it. I'm a retired firefighter. I spent 30 years of my life dealing with the consequences of uncontrolled fires, and I can tell you that wind-blown embers from any source, whether it's a barbecue, a fire pit, or a fallen power line, are a legitimate fire risk, especially in a dry season. This was the moral twist, the unexpected pivot. Instead of fighting each other over petty rules, we should be working together to keep our community safe. Therefore, I'd like to propose something. I want to volunteer my 3 decades of fire safety experience to help this board create a real, community-wide fire safety and prevention plan. We can establish clear, fair guidelines for grilling, create defensible space around our homes, and educate residents on fire extinguisher use. He took a breath, letting his offer sink in. And as a personal gesture of goodwill and commitment to this community, the community I live next to, I will voluntarily move my smoker to a different part of my yard, further away from any neighboring homes, to ensure no one is ever bothered. I'm not your enemy. I'm your neighbor, and I want us all to be safe and to live in peace. He stepped back from the podium. The clock on the wall read 0:07. He had finished with 7 seconds to spare. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then, someone in the back started to clap. Another person joined, and then another. And within seconds, the entire room, save for the dais, erupted in thunderous applause. Rodney hadn't just won an argument. He had won the respect of the community. The applause was a wave that crashed over the dais, leaving the board of directors stunned in its wake. Betty Dobbins sat frozen, her face a pallid mask of disbelief. The gavel in her hand seemed to have lost all its authority, for the first time since anyone could remember. She had lost control of the room. Before Betty could even attempt to regain order, Margaret, the stern-faced board member who had told her to let Rodney speak, leaned decisively into her microphone. Her voice, sharp and commanding, cut through the applause. "I believe Mr. Fielding has raised matters of grave concern that require immediate board action," she declared, her eyes fixed not on Rodney, but on Betty. "Therefore, pursuant to our bylaws, I move for an immediate vote of no confidence in our board president, Betty Dobbins, on the grounds of malfeasance and acting outside the scope of her authority." A fresh wave of murmurs and shouts of "second" swept through the audience. "This is out of order," Betty stammered, finally finding her voice. But it was too late. Her power had vanished. "I believe it is entirely in order," Margaret retorted coolly. "I also move that the board immediately and retroactively rescind all fines and legal threats issued to Mr. Fielding. I move that we direct our legal counsel to file the necessary paperwork to void the fraudulent corrective affidavit from June 2018. And finally, I move that we authorize a full independent financial audit of this association's records for the past 6 years, with a specific focus on legal expenditures authorized by the president without a full board vote." Each motion was like a hammer blow, systematically dismantling Betty's reign. The man from Crestwood Management, still on speakerphone, could be heard frantically whispering to someone off mic, Maria, her earlier fear replaced by a newfound courage, formally seconded Margaret's omnibus motion. A homeowner in the front row, a lawyer himself, stood up. A vote of no confidence requires a simple majority of the homeowners present at an annual meeting. Call the questions. The room roared its approval. Margaret called for a show of hands. A forest of arms shot into the air in favor of the motion. When she asked for those opposed, only 2 hands were raised, one belonging to the mousy woman on the board, the other, tentatively, to another of Betty's allies. It was an overwhelming, crushing defeat. Betty Dobbins simply stared out at the sea of faces the neighbors she had fined, harassed, and governed who had just stripped her of her power, for the first time since he'd met her. Rodney saw her posture fail her. Her shoulders, always held in rigid defiance, slumped forward by a fraction of an inch, a geological shift in her personal topography. She said nothing. She didn't have to. Her silence was a concession. The Queen had been deposed. Weeks later, the dust began to settle. The independent audit, as Margaret had suspected, was damning. It revealed that Betty Dobbins had not only directed the lawyer to file the illegal affidavit, but had also used over $3,000 of HOA funds to pay for the action, burying the expense under a vague general legal consultation line item in the budget. This wasn't just malfeasance. It was embezzlement, faced with the irrefutable evidence and the threat of criminal charges. Betty quietly resigned from the board. A for sale sign appeared on her perfectly manicured lawn less than a month later. A new board was elected in a special session, with Margaret as president and Maria as vice president. Their first official act was to send Rodney a formal letter of apology on behalf of the entire community. Their second was to enthusiastically accept his offer to lead a new community-wide fire safety committee. The HOA's lawyer, Jonathan Barrows, was promptly fired, and a new local firm was hired with a mandate for transparency. On a warm Saturday afternoon in late summer, The air in Willow Hollow was once again filled with the rich, fragrant aroma of hickory smoke. But this time, it wasn't a source of conflict. It was an invitation. Rodney stood in his backyard, tending to the arbiter, which now sat on a new concrete pad in the opposite corner of his property, a location he and the Fire Safety Committee had determined was the safest and most considerate spot. The yard was filled with people, not just his close friends, but dozens of his neighbors from Willow Hollow Estates. Margaret was there, laughing with Sarah. Mr. Harrison, the semi-retired title clerk, had made a special appearance, holding a plate piled high with brisket and looking deeply satisfied. Rodney had organized a community-wide barbecue to celebrate. He called it the Good Neighbor Smokeout. He had invited everyone, wanting to mend the fences Betty had worked so hard to erect. People brought side dishes and desserts, their offerings lining several long folding tables. Kids played tag in the yard, their laughter mixing with the sound of Jake's acoustic guitar. As Rodney sliced into a perfectly rendered brisket, its bark dark and crispy, its interior moist and tender, he looked out at the crowd. He saw a collection of neighbors who were no longer divided by arbitrary rules and imagined threats. They were simply people, sharing food and enjoying a beautiful day together. He had fought a battle not just to protect his own peace, but to redefine what community truly meant. It wasn't about control and compliance. It was about respect, goodwill, and the simple, unifying power of a perfectly smoked piece of meat. This was the community Betty Dobbins always claimed to be protecting, but had never managed to build.